Chapter 30. Sea of Blades. Sabrina tore away the bottom of her shirt, dipped it into the stream, and wrapped it around her mouth and nose. The scent of sweaty cotton and stream water filled her nostrils. The valley had been transformed into a nightmare of twisted metal and charred trees. Curled human forms lay with tongues of flames flickering about them, their skin charred black, their clothes drifting away in ashes. All recognizable landmarks had been erased. Tents had been ripped away, runners tipped, trees uprooted. Sabrina rode the cycle close to the river, rolling over withered grass and smoldering debris. She did her best to estimate where the hospital tent had stood, and more importantly, where the runner containing her suit had been parked. There were survivors, although no one was uninjured. Their hair and clothes were seared away, and their faces lacerated, their wounds terrible and bloody, their skin blistered. Deeper into the camp, believers who had been spared death were helping each other. One man missing an arm carried a man missing a leg from the knee down. A woman in bloody hospital garb leaned against a tree, her face ghostly white and eerily blank, as she pulled her severed leg alongside her and set it beside her bloody stump. Her eyes followed the passing soldiers, as if expecting one to stop. Sabrina could not turn away from her gaze. She idled the cycle and knelt down. The woman's lips were moving, and she had to lean in close to hear her voice. "Water." Sabrina took a canteen from the cycle and filled it from the stream, though the water was fouled with ash and oil. The woman moved a trembling hand off her lifeless leg and took the canteen. With the other hand, she tried to grab Sabrina, but Sabrina wrenched herself away. "I'm sorry. I have to go." Sabrina stopped beside the inferno that had been the hospital tent, the metal frames of the cots warping in the heat, and the plastic cabinets of supplies collapsing in molten puddles. The runner she was looking for had fallen halfway into the river, its cab partly submerged, the water as high as the steering wheel and the instrumentation panels. She waded in to reach the storage lockers at the side. In the chaos of the bombed camp, it had been easy to find an abandoned blaster lying on the ground, and she used one to blow open the locks, one after the other. She threw clothes, shoes, and blankets over her shoulder and into the water. When the heat from the encroaching flames grew unbearable, she wrapped a sodden blanket across her back and continued to rummage through the supplies. Wherever her bare skin was exposed, the heat stung, but she kept searching, splashing water on herself as her desperation grew. Her suit wasn't in the first two lockers. When her suit wasn't in the lockers on the other side of the runner, she began to panic, striking the fender with her fist. One storage case had fallen free of the runner and was stuck deep into the ground just above her, the impact snapping the lock. She scrambled up the slope of the bank, the wet blanket sloughing on her as she tossed the case upside down. The smooth black mesh of her patrol suit tumbled out, and she snatched it up, holding it close to her face before stripping down, slipping it on, and slapping the power cell into her belt. She picked up another abandoned blaster and holstered it, strapping the first to her ankle.
"Sabrina!"
It was Grange's voice, but she barely recognized the figure who had spoken the words. He lay sprawled against a rock, one of the fallen fig trees crushed against his chest, his eyes watering, and his lips and face blistered. The tree had absorbed most of the heat of the blast, but its smoldering trunk was burning him. Sabrina raced over, lifted the tree, and threw it into the river, where its curled leaves trembled in clouds of hissing steam. His beard was burned to the skin of his face. His clothes were gray with ash. The tree off him, he managed to stand, leaning heavily on Sabrina. The skin of his hands was by turns red, yellow, and black. She tried to help him to the bank of the stream where the surrounding flames and smoke were thinner. The cracking of projectile rifles erupted on the ridge. The turbines of an Elved screamed closer.
"Grange," she said. "It's coming back. Come on, get into the river."
He resisted her, pulling his arm free.
"No, I'm not fighting."
"I'm not asking you to fight, just to hide," she yelled as the roar of the turbines grew. Grange shook his head, brushing the debris from his hair.
"My faith is my sword and my shield,"
he said, kneeling down and gingerly placing his burnt hands together.
"Don't be a fool, Grange!"
she screamed over the gunfire.
"I will pick you up and carry you if I have to." "Don't you dare. He spared me once already, and he will again. Our master is one of love and faith. Grange, make your choice, Sabrina.
When she raised the blaster and depressed the setting to stun, she saw Bran staring back at her. The roar crescendoed overhead, joined by the second sound of a rocket engine igniting and ripping into the air. The gunfire ceased as rebels ran for cover. She darted for the river, her feet tripping on hot, crackling debris. Her ears were filled with the boom of detonation, and a noise like a flag snapping in the breeze as a wall of flames surged through the remaining trees, strangling trunks and branches, sucking the oxygen from the air in a backdraft that sent ashes and dust into her face in a hot wind. She hit the water and dove beneath the surface, the hiss of fire on the surface reaching her on the bottom. Smooth pebbles tumbled under her hands as she tried to find a hold, finally settling upon some exposed tree roots. Currents as hot as bath water passed over her. She pressed herself into the bed of the stream, holding her breath until she thought her lungs would burst and she would pass out. As she waited for the flames to dissipate, she felt another blast. The surface of the water roiled with bubbles and steam, and waves slapped the banks. Finally, she either had to rise for air or drown. She surfaced into an inferno, the water steaming. A wall of flames towered before her, crowned with impenetrable black smoke. The heat radiated through any part of her suit that was not submerged. Updrafts of hot air gusted wildly, sending up vortexes of charred tent fabric, smoking twigs and ash. She saw no sign of Grange, and heard no cries. Where he had knelt was nothing but roaring flames. The tree she had thrown had been reduced to half its original size, a withered husk leaning against the twisted wreckage of the runner, its metal marbled black and gray from the heat. A blast shook her and sent ripples through the water as another rocket exploded farther down the valley. She pulled her visor over her eyes, kept her shirt over her mouth, and waded upstream, straining to look past the bodies and the body parts floating around her. At the head of the camp, where the flames tapered off, she got lucky. She found a cycle that was still intact. She charged the engine and started for Fortinbras. She entered the city on Miller Road, which took her through the blocks. CRPs full of frightened people sped past. A few tried pulling her over, recognizing her as a member of the security ministry, but she waved them away. Some CRPs she passed were ominously empty, pulled to the side of the road, the doors left open, the occupants nowhere to be found. Diagoras Avenue, the main thoroughfare through the blocks, was impassable, a barricade of stacked furniture and scrap metal rising from the street as high as second-story windows. A half-dozen figures tracked her from the other side, peering through gaps between kitchen chairs and reclamation bins. She could not be certain what alliances and sides might have sprung up during the attacks. After all, she was just blocks away from the same alleyway where she had seen the words, "Theopen will set us free," scrawled onto a wall. To avoid confrontation, she turned down an alleyway to seek a detour, the cycle turbines roaring off the close walls, the wheel bouncing through the drainage gutter. She emerged with a clothesline across the windscreen. As she tugged it free, people ran past, making for the few houses with open front doors and windows dark with furniture and boards thrown across them. A man carrying a young child and towing an older one behind hurried past. An old woman pounded on a door for someone to let her inside. A teenage boy ran into the street carrying a young boy, his face gone snow white, his neck a bloody, gaping wound. A window shutter opened and closed as she passed. Infrared showed that people were clustered inside the homes in tight knots on the upper floors. She clicked back to the visible spectrum just as a woman with a bloodied face leapt in front of her cycle. She could not stop in time and rolled over the woman, the tires thumping against her chest cavity, compressing the air out of her lungs so that she coughed and gagged. Sabrina wrenched the steering column and slammed on the brake, the injury in her right leg causing her to cry out. The woman was dressed in formal slacks with a sharp crease in them. Her white blouse shimmered, but was spattered with blood that also darkened the ends of her graying hair. Her face was invisible, her chin down on her chest, but she had already sat up, surprising Sabrina. "Are you all right? Get away from her!" a voice cried out from one of the windows. The woman snapped her head in Sabrina's direction. Her eyes were wide, white balls in her sockets, her mouth a gaping hole of gore, Her tongue flicked back and forth across teeth matted with what looked like flesh. She leapt up quickly with the recovery of an elite pitchball player.
"Run!"
Another voice called out from the windows. The woman was already charging Sabrina, a feral screech rending the air. Sabrina could not ditch her cycle, nor turn it around in time. She drew her blaster and fired 3 stuns into the woman to no effect. With the woman nearly an arm's reach away, she flicked the setting to lethal and fired a bolt of rose-colored plasma into the woman's leg. A cloud of red vapor sprayed out onto the cobblestones along with a hiss not unlike that of flesh over flame. When she breathed in, the air smelled of cooked meat. The woman's face slapped against the street while she gnashed at the cobblestones with her teeth, her fingers digging between them to pull her forward, her good leg flailing like some hideous tail, pushing her towards Sabrina, the slacks on the injured leg smoldering. Sabrina turned the cycle and charged the throttle to full, speeding down the narrow street to put as much distance between herself and the thing as possible. Her hand was shaking as she adjusted the rearview mirror to reassure herself that the woman had not recovered and followed her. With her eyes on the mirror, she never saw the cable across the road until its braided metal was in her face. The windscreen snapped with a loud pop. The impact was like being struck with a club. The cycle skidded away, scraping to a stop on its side. She found herself flung backwards onto the street. Dazed, she could barely move. She was marginally aware of the 2 teenage boys who emerged from an adjacent alleyway. Too weakened to look up, she listened as they righted the cycle, climbed on, charged its engine, and fled down the street, disappearing around a corner. It was quiet, the way a city street could be quiet, while more distant sounds floated overhead. Sirens, the hiss and crackle of plasma rifles, staccato shouts barked out, but no footsteps. No bloody-faced ferals like that woman. Sabrina crawled to a sidewalk where she caught her breath. When she stood up, her right leg and left foot protested. Her neck hurt to move as well from being hung up on the cable. She fired a shot at the place where it was anchored to the wall, only to miss, the brickwork splintering apart with each misfire. It took 3 more shots before one of her attempts struck true, and the cable dropped to the ground.
Not good.
She checked the power cell of the blaster. It was full. What she did not have in accuracy, she would be able to make up for in quantity of shots. She took stock of her assets. The cycle was gone, but she had an extra blaster and a charged top-of-the-line patrol suit. She was just 10 blocks from the station, where she could retrieve more weapons and different transportation. She checked the communicator on her visor. Dead. All communications had been wiped out. The most immediate threat, the ferals, those citizens rendered mad by the destruction of the comm towers, were at least easily recognizable. They were fast, strong, inhumanly so, but they were also dumb. It was not a cunning rage, but simple, atavistic. Given enough lead time, she could deal with that. Other threats, rebels, had moved on to different areas, perhaps to engage security forces. She wondered if other officers would see her as friend or foe. To that point, would rebels? She sighed. She was likely the only one in this fight without an ally. It was time to move, and she forced her legs to stand. Pain doubled her over, her rib now adding to the aggravation in her legs. After straightening a second time, she limped down the street, stopping often to lean against the wall, her blaster lifted to her eye level, every corner, window, and door studied through the crosshairs of her weapon. The suit knew she was injured. The visor readout indicated that treatment was underway. She felt cool pressure on her most severe injuries as the suit emitted an analgesic, the compound causing more pain on the seared flesh of her right foot before it began to feel better. After a while, she could manage a brisk walk, just short of a jog. The pain from her rib, which she was sure was fractured, lessened. Now the screams and shouts she had heard earlier were closer, as a new wave of fleeing citizens stampeded past. Off her bike, she could not ignore them, although she did her best to shrug off their pleading hands and faces. Wide-eyed people told of their relatives going into rages, killing their own children. They did not understand what was happening. Where was the security ministry? Could she help? Could she explain?
I could. But would they believe me? Or doubt, like I did?
They spoke in a rush of panicked words, talking of smoke rising from the south, comm towers toppling down, armed men running through the streets, firing at officers. Sabrina told them which streets she had traveled, so they knew which routes were safe. When it was clear she was headed in the opposite direction, they left her alone, staring bewilderedly at her as they paced down the street to safety, and she toward danger. The ferals were easy to distinguish, wandering blood-soaked through the streets, their backs hunched, their heads down, like coiled snakes ready to strike. She fired on them, torn between the knowledge she was removing a threat and the truth that she was simply killing an innocent victim of a more widespread violation. Weinlard Street was a massacre. Bodies were strewn about, great pools of blood congealed among cobblestones. It was difficult to tell the ferals from their victims, but as she neared the bodies, she could see at least 3 ferals were dead, their heads swollen from blows, their necks twisted around. The residents had been able to put up some defense, although at the cost of at least 6 of their own lives. At Resnick Street, a feral stood up from over a boy's body where it had been feeding and charged her. The feral had once been a slender man with bright blue eyes and short-cropped hair. Now those eyes were bulging, the hair stained red with blood. Long legs and arms gave it speed and a dangerous reach. She fired 2 shots, each going wide. The third struck it in the chest. It scampered around a corner into an alleyway. She followed, fired again, hitting its leg. It dropped to the ground. She closed in to kill it, but even as she looked up from its dead body, she knew she was losing precious time.
I don't have time to be an exterminator.
She moved down the street at a faster pace. Around the next corner, a barricade of crates and furniture stood in her way. This one was abandoned. Worse, it had been breached. A gap where a kitchen table had been shoved aside by a feral, leaving bloody handprints, was a silent testament to the defenders' defeat. A dead man lay on the other side, his killer having left a trail of bloody footprints into the adjacent alleyway. She covered 4 more blocks. Houses were empty, infrared showing her nothing but cold rooms. She had just 5 more blocks to go to reach the station, but after 3 she found activity in a house on the corner. She switched to the visible spectrum. Bodies of a mother and child lay strewn across the curb farther down the road. The building in front of her was an apartment complex, but no door faced her. 2 lone figures wandered the floors. Even on infrared, she could recognize them as ferals. She was prepared to leave both to their rampaging, but one on the 3rd floor was swinging a limb at a thin red line that the visor detected as a wall or door. In the next room, she could make out a closet with 3 small blobs bunched together.
Children.
She raced down the alleyway, leaping over 3 bodies. As she searched for the entrance, the pounding of the feral in the apartment above stopped. A switch to infrared showed that the bedroom door had given way, and the feral was racing across the room. It stopped short of the children. The pounding resumed, this time on an even thinner closet door. A stairwell entrance was on her left. She raced up, ignoring the protests of her leg and foot. The hallway on the 3rd floor was bare and abandoned. She kicked in the first door and entered the apartment, only to realize she was in the wrong one. The pounding was coming from the next room over. A wall stood between her and the children. A family portrait fell from it as the feral continued its attack on the other side. She retraced her steps, crashing through the bedroom, living room, and hallway again, finding the next apartment door was already open, bloody handprints across it. She entered, blaster raised. First the hallway. Next was the living room, where she noted scattered toys. She entered the kitchen, calling out and trying to attract the feral's attention. The kitchen table was cluttered with glossy magazines. Children's drawings hung on the walls. A pot was melting on the stove, filling the air with an acrid smell. She kicked over a child's high chair, but the noise was drowned out by a sound like a tree branch cracking, followed by the screams of terrified children. She abandoned caution and bolted through the doorway, rounding a corner into the bedroom. The closet door had given way, but the oldest child, a lithe blonde girl of no more than 10, was holding it in place, frustrating the reach of the feral, a rotund woman in a nightshirt, her brown hair a tangled mess stuck together with gore. Sabrina did not have a clear shot without endangering the children, so she ran across the room, jumping on the bed, and cried out, "Hey!" The woman turned, wide-eyed, snarling. Sabrina fired 2 shots at her head, 2 at her chest. She fell, still twisting for the closet door, her jaws working like a fish struggling for air. Sabrina fired 2 more shots into the back of her skull. She held the blaster away as she stepped through the red mist hanging in the air and pulled the door back. The blonde girl had her arms around a younger child with dark hair of about 6, and an even younger boy about 3.
"It's all right now. I'm here to help."
The girl surprised Sabrina by helping the other 2 children out of the wreckage of the closet, handing over the boy, who immediately wrapped his arms around Sabrina's neck. Then the oldest led the younger girl out by the hand and said to her,
"Don't look, Nani,"
as they passed the dead feral. Once they were away from the body, Sabrina bent down and said,
"You did really good. What's your name?"
"Amat. That is my brother Drim, and this is Nani. She's our neighbor."
"You know where your parents are?"
Amat shook her head. Sabrina told her it was all right, and that she would take them someplace safe. They followed her down the hallway, their feet a comforting patter behind her. She was trying to find a way to position her blaster while holding on to Drim when she turned the corner and saw the man standing in the kitchen. His shirt was unbuttoned, his tails hanging over his undershorts, which squeezed tight against his fat, hairy legs. His beard was tinged with red particles, and his nostrils flared repeatedly as he took in the smell of the melting pot on the stove. 2, she cursed herself. There had been 2 ferals, she remembered now. She threw Drim to his sister. He began screeching. The man lunged. Sabrina raised her blaster, only to have the shot go wide as Drim jumped back on her. She stumbled backwards, tossing the boy again, and screaming at Amat to hold him. She knew the feral was right behind her, and she threw out a back kick with her left foot, her burns exploding in pain as she struck the man in his sternum. He was too big to stop, and he fell forward on top of her. Her blaster clattered to the floor out of reach. They traded blows, her arms quickly reaching the limits of their endurance. The feral was most interested in the children. After striking home with 2 punches to Sabrina's face, he extricated himself to pursue smaller quarry. Amat had raced away with Drim in her arms, but Nani had frozen in the middle of the hall, a puddle forming at her feet. Sabrina grabbed the man's foot, anger providing her more speed than the suit could have ever produced. She wrenched his foot and dragged him, flopping and screaming, back into the kitchen. A block of knives on the counter caught her attention, and she reached for it, but he kicked free of her, standing between her and the blaster. His nostrils hissed, and his teeth ground together. Her face only reached the level of his shoulders, and he reared to an even greater height. Sabrina grabbed the melting pot from the stove and threw it into his face. He roared, but still came across the room towards her, the floor shaking under his weight. She dove for the knives, but he caught her midway and threw her. The kitchen table collapsed beneath her as she landed. Magazines made a fluttering noise as they tumbled from the table to the floor. The children's drawings ripped away from the walls and fell across her prone body. He was immediately on top of her, one eye clouded and burnt with debris from the melted pot, his teeth making a clacking noise as he bit at her face. She tried kicking with her left leg, but it was still too painful. She raised her right, planting her foot in his chest, but his weight was enormous. Her knee was soon in her face as he pressed even closer, the tips of his fingers scraping at her eyes. She gave a renewed push to buy herself a gulp of air, but he was quickly pressing back, twisting her head as he pulled her hair. She raised the other leg, but it caused her to slide down the table. He started striking at her head. She kicked wildly, her ankle passing through her field of vision. Her ankle where she had strapped the spare blaster. He bore down on her, breaking past her defenses, the hair of his face, the sweat from his pores, his mouth open with its gnashing teeth so close. She could smell his body's stink, his fetid breath. Lights in her eyes as he struck her head. She felt for her blaster, her awareness coming apart, split to pieces under each blow. Her thumb on the safety as he fell against her, turning her wrist against the weight of his body to aim. A man of similar size, his shoulders great mounds under a checkered shirt, his chest a wall of musculature that had so many times served her as a pillow. Her father. His back was to her as he fought with her mother, who was screaming, beating him in hysterics. Her swinging arms knocked over appliances and spilled jars of rice and spices, soapy water from the sink. She was uncontrollable. Feral. Her father's eye was swelling and bruised, his forehead and cheeks bleeding from her nails raking his face. A button of his shirt had popped off and fallen to the kitchen floor. Sabrina bent to pick it up from the scattered coffee beans and rice grains, and then another button as it fell, when her father cried out.
"Stay back, Annalise!"
He said it over his shoulder, then it was her mother's face that was there, the skin on her chin wrinkling as she pressed against him, hissing between her teeth.
"I'll kill her!"
Her father pleaded. He called for help. He had pinned his wife between the counter and the sink, holding her back. Sabrina hated every moment of it. She did not understand. She cried for them to stop, but then her mother lunged for her. Her dress ripped as he held her back, legs kicking into the air, her arms stretching out for Sabrina with curled fingers.
"Lies! Liar! All lies! You! I hate you! Hate all of you! You're not even my husband! What have they done? All of you who hate tricked us!"
Her father's brow furrowed, pleading.
"Miriam, please, she's your daughter. It's me, Peter. Oh, please."
His arms so powerful, Sabrina trusted him to hold her and twirl her high above his head. Never once did she ever fear falling. She could never imagine pain or hurt from those arms. But just as Peter could never harm Sabrina, he could not harm his wife. As Miriam relaxed for a moment, causing him to relent, she took advantage of his lapse and spun away, diving across the room, again for Sabrina. In that moment, Sabrina knew her mother would kill her. And it was her mother, so she could not resist. She knew she must deserve to die. Her father screamed, a sound deep from that drum of a chest, so loud that Sabrina thought it actually caused the front door to explode. There were men running into the house. One tossed aside a chair and raised a gun as he came to the middle of the room. Her father yelled, his face bloody. His wife in a torn dress ran from him. Of course, he looked the aggressor. For a moment, he looked to be the feral. The man in the center of the room fired 2 shots into that chest. That wall that Sabrina had thought could never break, broke in 2 bloody pops. Her father fell against the counter, his eyes wide, his cheeks puffed with escaping breath, the cabinet splashed with red, his feet sliding on beans, his gaze on his daughter as she still clutched his shirt button. Her mother was bearing down in her direction, her hair a dark halo about her, the whites of her eyes so wide. A 3rd shot threw her mother against the wall. She crumpled, lying on the floor as if overtaken by sleep, her hair now matted and wet. More men swept into the room, bending over the invisible form of her father behind the counter. Sabrina found herself staring at a splash of red on the wall that was her mother, and was not her mother. This was so much worse than when she had colored on the wall with her crayons, or when she had spilled her juice on the couch. This redness was a stain no amount of paint would cover. Sabrina's eyes slid to a place on the wall that was undisturbed, where a painting of a sailboat, its sail a chip of white on a rocky silvery sea, a sea of blades, hung. Why was she so worried, she thought, when she could send that little girl, Annalise, who caused all of this, whose own mother hated her so, whose own mother wanted her to die, to that little boat? She could even see her, a small speck of black, small and so insignificant that only Sabrina knew she was there on that sea beneath that sail. Forgotten. Exiled where she deserved to be. In her place was a girl who was invulnerable and strong, like the man who had stopped her parents from fighting, who had brought order, who lifted her up in his arms in that very moment to hold her, his voice booming and commanding to the men around him, yet his face wet with tears. She would be strong and bring order like him. He said his name was Dag.